I'm Scott Worthge, and I'm presenting today for New MR on the subject of synthetic data and more particularly synthetic data modeling. We'll look at that differentiation in a moment, but what I wanted to start out with is really to let you know what will I cover in a brief time today to really talk about where I've been, what I've done, some things that I've found out, but more importantly, where are I and other people investigating synthetic data and synthetic data modeling going? Where's the frontier and the exploration going on as next steps in evaluating what all of this is and does and means for researchers? We're going to start with a definition and really talk about synthetic data in several forms and several applications of that. I'm going to talk about a couple of areas where I did some early exploration and tests of synthetic data against real fielded surveys and what were differences and similarities I found there. And again, the points 3 and 4 about where are things heading as I see them in some of the areas I'm working on personally. Now, my background is I've been primarily a quant guy for quite a long time. And I've taught notably at UC Berkeley and at Michigan State's Masters in Market Research program for a long time. But all that to say, the time that we're in right now, the tools and technology and the advancements that I'm seeing, the pace of change is, I believe, greater than anything I've seen in all of the years that I've been working and teaching. It's exciting to me, but at the same time, it's challenging. It's challenging because we need to take a look very critically at what it is that we have before us and the claims being made and what people say these new technologies, synthetic data very much included, can do, will do, and find out for ourselves, what do they really deliver? This is one of my favorite sayings, and it guides the work that I do now. Most of my investigations are really about new technology and how it compares to existing methods that researchers have known and trusted for quite a long time. So let's start with that definition. It's really very simple if you take a look at the first sentence here about synthetic data being generated rather than real world produced. In the survey world, I've looked at that as what I call collected. Nope, it's created. And so it's data that we aren't getting from B2B or B2C respondents. It's not something that's coming out of the normal way that we would collect data. It's something that's being generated. And we'll talk a little bit about algorithms and mathematical models in just a moment. Now, if you think about synthetic data, it's not a market research topic. It's not something exclusive to our industry in the least. One of my favorite examples is self-driving cars. If you think about a car on the streets of San Francisco that's going to be rolling up to someone and they get in and there's no driver. Those cars are out there now in a number of US cities. How did that car get trained? Synthetic data was very much part of the instructions that car used in order to be able to perform its function. So think of a simple roadmap being layered in. That in itself is a form of synthetic data. But also think of all of the other information that car needs to drive. It needs to be able to see road signs and recognize what they are, crosswalks, other cars, people, all sorts of situations and scenarios that had to be fed into the programming of that car. It didn't watch a bunch of videos. It was fed synthetic data to train the car in what to do. And in any of these other industries, one of the things that I've talked about with a client is they said, we're using synthetic data to do simulations of our manufacturing lines. If we add new packaging machinery, if we speed up the line, what will happen? What's the tolerances of the machines? If we do this, maybe it'll go this way. If we do that, it'll go a different way. They're running simulations based on synthetic data for their actual plant operation. But let's now drill down into the world of market research. And there are two main areas that in the past have been differentiated, although we'll see they're blending a bit already now. The first that we're not going to be speaking to today, digital personas or twins. There you're talking about consumer simulations, and there's so much going on in that area. companies, technologies. I've seen some amazing stuff there where you're getting essentially a digital representation of a consumer. And you can interact with it in many cases. You can ask it information and it will reply back for any number of different ways to not deal again with a real person. You're generating information from something digital. Well, I'm going to put that on the shelf now because I'm going to focus on the second area of modeling where I've been doing my work. Synthetic data modeling specifically is working with existing data, like the picture on the right. Think of survey data that you have, but you're trying to do something with that data. You're trying to amplify it, multiply it, as we'll see in just a moment. The first and foremost application, what's been traditional up to this point, if we can call a couple of years traditional, is that synthetic data modeling is used to enhance survey data sets. And I'll show you two examples of tests that I did in just a moment. But if you think about what synthetic data modeling is doing, it's using algorithms to perform mathematical, statistical processes. And if you think about it and you look into the literature, you'll find that there have been different methods of trying to do exactly, well, not trying, doing what synthetic data modeling is doing for years and years, decades, in fact. If you talk to statisticians or any of the data science folks out there and discuss with them methods such as mice and SMOT, nearest neighbor, GANs, there are all sorts of ways that have been around a very long time where people are looking at existing data and trying to project data they don't have. So I say synthetic data modeling is the latest tool, the latest advancement in an area that actually is very solidly traditional in the world of market research and statistics and data science. If you think about a very simplistic example of data and market research, think of weighting. Everyone says, who's worked with survey data, oh yeah, I've weighted something to make the data I had match a demographic population proportion. Well, you're shifting data there. It's not really quite the same, but if you think of the ability to model data during weighting, you start to get the idea of what synthetic data modeling is doing. You'll see more examples in a moment. Now, I wish I had about an hour to talk through this slide. The key thing here is to take a look at what is modeling doing with my data set. If you talk, Scott, about generating data, how does synthetic data modeling operate? Well, again, you're using an algorithm and you're working off of machine learning versus LLMs. It's an important distinction there. You're not essentially asking ChatGPT to hand you data. These are actually computational methods that look at the data you have. They look at the distributions, the relationships, the trends within the data. And what they're able to do is match up multiple models. Synthetic data modeling doesn't create one model and that's it. It often generates anywhere from 10 to, I've seen as much as 200 models for a data set, looking at the relationships of the data that you have and the data that you want in quite a few different ways, perspectives, angles, in order to come up with what's the best projection. It's almost, and it doesn't do it justice, but it's almost in very like a regression among all of the models to find the best fit for, again, what you're starting with and where you're trying to go. And you can see in the middle, the model creates artificial responses because it's mirroring those patterns. It's looking at the data that you have. It's looking at what you don't have. It's trying to use what you have to fill gaps or boost groups that aren't represented as much. And then ideally, it's going to reduce bias, but we'll see a couple of questions related to that in just a moment. Now, I've worked with a company, LivePanel, in the upper by that small logo there, and they have a technology called N Infinite. The other company, and I also know them well and have done some work with them, is called Fairgen. LivePanel is out of Argentina. Fairgen is out of Israel. Those are the two predominant players in synthetic data modeling commercial services. Now, you can see right here, and the purpose of this slide is really to say there's more than one way to model. The full profile, the express, the light are methods of modeling that LivePanel uses. And you can see some of the different conditions here under which one type of modeling versus a different one would be used. Very important. Look right in the middle there under Express where it says the boosting limit, the goal is to multiply the data set. I look at that as the solution or the application that you might have for some of the different ethnic groups, the underrepresented groups, the minorities in a lot of sampling plans. Less acculturated Hispanics is the example I give. Everyone knows if you're trying to run a survey in the US and you're trying to get Hispanics that are less acculturated, less time in the US, any of the factors you might use to identify them, that you're always going to run short. It's very difficult to engage that group. So that might be an example of a data set where you're trying to boost it versus some of the others where you're trying to maybe fill in data more so than take one group and make it much larger representatively. Well, I mentioned I was exploring things early. When I started in with synthetic data, I couldn't find anything published. I didn't see anyone testing this new technology, this new idea of taking survey data and generating more from it. I heard some early conference work. I didn't see any real data coming from them, but claims way back 2 years ago being made about modeling being able to get survey responses where we didn't collect them from people. And I said, this isn't good enough for me. I need to know how this works. In a sense, I want to test drive the car rather than someone telling me there's some new great technology for this automobile. Well, I took a test that I had run a survey for a different conference where I had a lot of attitudinal 5-point scales. And I said, let's take some data out of this and have LivePanel model it for us. Well, we had 2 test cases, as you see here. We took out, call it 400 out of 1,200, where the first test case, we punched holes in the data. The second test case, we wiped clean 385 responses, left the demographics so that the modeling could see our targets and match it back to other relationships within the larger data set we had. We didn't give them the survey. We simply gave them the data sets with some missing values, as if we had incompleted surveys we normally would throw away. And then a project in a sense that we came up short. We couldn't fill all the quotas. They modeled the data. They handed it back to us. We did a comparison of means for the values that we had calculated for the attitudinal scales. And we got this. And when I first saw this, I said, wait a minute, what am I seeing here? I have a collaborator, Kyle Hope, within Quest. He did the computations. He handed me this, and I said, Kyle, this looks like the same data that came from the original, and the partial being where we punched the holes in it, and the mean synthetic where we removed a third. This looks almost identical. The modeling worked that well? And the answer was generally, yeah, it did. Well, we did a second test. We were speaking at SMR Latam in 2025, and we worked with a company called Provokers out of Chile. They supplied a survey they had written. They had run in 4 countries, and we did the same testing. This time we just did the second test to literally in 4 countries wipe out 30% of the data, hand it to modeling company, have LivePanel hand it back, run the comparison. We thought, well, if it's math, if it's statistics, it shouldn't matter if it's different countries, somebody else's survey. And that's exactly what we saw. We saw the same kind of variances where the modeled data versus the real data. And again, this is wiping clean 30% of the data. That 30% of missing data being modeled had a variance of about 5% from the real data. And when you added that 400 back into the overall data set and then ran the variances, were under 2%. We said we've got something here, but the important thing, what I was mentioning before, where we're going next, there's a lot to be done. I'm seeing many more companies now starting to test and a few starting to publish. I am wary really of how well synthetic data works until I see it work in a lot of different conditions. And you can see here on the top left, attitudinal scales. Those were our first 2 tests. We've charted out at Quest about 6 different types of data that we're going to be testing in the next month or 2. A big question is in the upper right. How much data do you have to start with? Can you model reliably from 80% of the data? What if you have 60% of the data? What type of material difference do you see, or do you see? And again, I don't find people publishing explorations and real world tests like we've done to answer those questions. A really interesting thing are the bottom two right points, more profiling and using outside data. Can you bring in a lot of, say, transactional data on a finance tracker to model and add to survey data and demographics you've got from the latest wave? Again, these are all areas that are under exploration that we think are critical to evaluate and go well beyond the very simplistic comparison of means that we had so far. Well, really, why are we doing all this? What does this matter? And I think when we take a look at saying that bridging gaps and generating data and forecasting data, that's been with us since 40s, 50s, where people are always trying to say, if we're missing something, how can we try to fill in the values? Specific to the survey world, underrepresented groups, there are always groups that we can't get enough of, we can't get access to. Can we use modeling to generate that information? And already we're starting to venture into some ethical areas. If you use data from certain individuals and then model from that, does that violate privacy laws or concerns? Lots of different things there, but bottom line, synthetic data is not going away. It's going to get bigger and more important. But we want to avoid building a house saying we've got solutions. These work. We can go employ them without doing the kind of testing and critical evaluation that I spoke about. And on the same frontier about changes in synthetic data, we're seeing so many other things that are starting to creep in. And again, half an hour on this slide easily, I could talk about developments with personas and agents, fully synthetic data coming from not a single consumer, completely generated survey data sets are starting to appear and be discussed. So many new frontiers, so many different areas that beg for exploration. But really, my bottom line is you need to actively investigate and engage in looking at synthetic data. Evaluate how well does it work for you, for your kind of projects, for your kind of stakeholders. And only then, when you've had the testing done and you've really very much looked over what kind of results you're getting and how well they serve you, can you embrace and feel comfortable using synthetic data. I would love to speak with those who might have questions or want to know more about the work I've done and the work that I know others are doing. So please feel free to contact me, and I hope all of this has been a helpful discussion of an area that I find very interesting and yet with many challenges yet to answer.
So, Scott, I missed a result. Does it help using synthetic data to create the last 30% of interviews? Could you re-explain what is plotted on the graph of the variance, what is represented on the y-axis?
What we're really looking at on that particular chart, we were looking at a comparison of means and what the data actually came up with when it was synthesized, the value itself, versus the entire survey. So question by question, what was the real answer? What was the synthetic answer? And the gap between those would show the variance. So that's a plot of the actual values. And I was shocked when I saw the overlap. I was expecting synthetic data might be close, but in that first example we had, the actual values the company returned to us compared to the real values. Ray, you were an early critic saying that, well, a simple comparison of means could miss a lot of the variability. Comparing only scale questions really isn't an accurate test. But again, this is going back 2 years when I couldn't find any tests and said, where do we start? So baby steps.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what they call a necessary but not sufficient criteria. If it wasn't getting the means right, we didn't have to look any further. Because it does get the means right means we have some other interesting issues. So let's go to the next question, because that links back to the very small gaps that do appear in those lines. So does synthetic data mean it's based on logic, rational decisions, If so, how do we cope with irrational humans?
Well, you're starting to venture into an area where I see personas and synthetic data modeling intersecting. 6 months ago, I wasn't even talking about that. I said the simulations of creating essentially, I put it very generally and too generally, but creating a custom LLM. You do a segmentation study. I'm working with a couple of finance customers who say, we've got four buyer types, and we're going to create a persona for each of them, feed them a ton of data, and then use them interactively. Well, we're not talking about anything like that here. We're saying essentially you ran a survey, you've got data. In the one case, the early test, we punched holes to say you always get incomplete surveys and you throw them away. Okay, could we salvage those? Could modeling fill in values that way, looking at other relationships in the data set? But the really interesting one to me was when we said we're actually simulating as if we ran short on a quota. We're at the end of a project. We've got most of it done, but we're missing for younger males and we're missing for ethnic Hispanics. Do we keep fielding and do we change the parameters? Those familiar in the sampling world, we often will relax the quotas, increase the incentives. You're introducing all sorts of potential bias in your sampling plan. Can we just model that data reliably instead to essentially finish the fielding for your project? And really, what I'm exploring a lot of, Ray, is now under what conditions? As you just said, if our first tests were way off, and I saw some very good foundational work a while back, same early period from Frank Kelly, and he did a test and he said, this, in my test, it didn't work. I just presented at the Corporate Researcher Conference with a gentleman named Tom Johnson, who's the lead of all consumer insights for Jack in the Box in the US. And we took a very purposely messy data set and said, what can synthetic data modeling do to improve this? And where will it not help because we've got some fundamental flaws, in a sense, in the data itself? I think the bottom line really is there's so much more to test, but the idea being here is that we're working with what I would call quant data sets. When you get into agents and personas and what are you feeding them and what are you training them to do, and then can you get them to answer survey questions? I'm seeing some really interesting experiments, but right now that's almost science fiction, to be able to prove that out, versus modeling being something that relies on other mathematical and statistical processes. But in a sense, it's kind of democratizing what we've seen used in other areas so it can be applied in actual market research projects kind of day to day.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions, Scott, and we're nearly out of time. So if we can try to go like really punchy answers, we'll see how we get on.
Well, the other thing, Ray, is that if we can collect all the questions, I would love to come up with a set of answers and bring it back to the audience.
Yeah, we will do that. Zoom is sometimes a bit flaky on whether it comes through. So actually, if you want to email questions to Scott, I'm sure that he would be delighted to get back to you. You probably want to use the App Market Research guy.
Yeah,
So if you
I'm
could stream
actually,
after this,
yeah,
that'd be great. But we'll take a couple more questions. Some
Okay,
great
certainly.
questions. What type of research studies would this type of synthetic data work best for, and why?
I wish I knew. That's the whole area is that my initial exploration, and you could see that the SML-ATOM test, that Provokers was so nice to provide their survey, their answers, so it was nothing I had generated. I want to do something much more objective in the testing. We don't know yet because I haven't seen other people publishing the results. I've been looking, if anybody here has any information about actual tests, I'm trying to collect and make that available, more easily accessible. But right now, the attitudinal scale stuff was very simplistic. Just ran a test where we modeled 15%, 25%, and 50% of the data from a starting set to say, let's put a stick in the sand and see what kind of answer do we get? I can't find that out there in the literature. I can't find anyone talking about this. So I'm going to keep investigating to try to answer these questions as best I can and bring them to forums like yours.
Brilliant. Does this type of synthetic data just boost the same responses you'd get from the original data, or are there extra insights or learnings by using synthetic data?
The echo chamber comment, and I really value that. And it seems to be intuitive that if you take 150 responses from those less acculturated Hispanics, and maybe there are flaws in the data, if you're trying to boost that quota through one of the methods I mentioned, aren't you only going to kind of echo and maybe even diminish from the original data? The whole point is with the modeling creating multiple models. It's not simply one and done. You would take those 150 out of maybe 1,000 responses you have, and you'd say, well, within the 150, what are the data patterns? What connects to males, older males, younger males, women? What connects to, other conditions that you might have in their profile? How long they've been in the US? What language do they speak at home? You're creating a model typically almost like a weighting for each one of those, and they pile on top of each other successively as you go through the survey. Again, it's difficult to explain quickly, but you're really looking at how does one variable connect to a whole host of other variables. Then you're coming at it from a second variable and say, now let me look at all of the other patterns independent of the first one. And you keep doing that for whatever is reasonable for the test you're doing. Then the algorithm brings it all back together and starts saying, where's the overlap? I almost think of it as a Venn diagram. You've got one model, then you have another model, and another, and another, and another. And eventually, where's the overlap? Where's the place where they all say, this looks like an answer? That's very simplistic, but that's essentially how it works.
Yeah, I mean, we need to unfortunately move on. So if you can put your email into the chat, then I'm sure people get back to you. But I would just add one thought, which is when we were all growing up as kids, we used to have these pictures with dots. And if you joined all the dots together, you ended up with a picture. And
Yeah.
I think that is when we talk about augmented synthetic data, that's kind of what we're doing. It's not going to add the sun above if there wasn't any dots for the sun above, but it fills in the picture so you can see what it is more clearly. And I think when it works, that's what it is.
Yeah, I'm seeing in the webinar chat someone mentioning Strat 7. I'm in conversations with Strat 7, and they are one company who has actually done some testing, done some publishing. I'm speaking with their staff and their data scientists, again, to keep testing, looking, finding out the cases where it does work well, where we can rely on this as a solution, but other cases where it may have serious limitations.
Brilliant. Okay, then, Scott, we will see you again soon. And in fact, anybody who's going to Prague for SML Congress will see Scott there.